Your conference is being recorded.
Okay.
Okay, let me...
Okay, just a second, please. Dr. Gaither, did you have anything you wanted to add before we begin?
No, I did not. I'll hold my questions till the end.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, and I forgot to mention that. Ki-Young, after you finish, then I will begin. I will let Dr. Gaither ask her questions, and then I'll ask questions, and then she'll ask, and you know we'll take it from there, and then in the end we will ask you to step away from the phone, from the line, for a few minutes for her and I to address and determine if we have any further requirements for you. Okay, so the call is now being recorded, and we are now set to begin. Good evening and good morning. This is the doctoral study final oral defense for Mr. Ki-Young Kim. My name is Dr. Gabriel Telleria. I am the chair of this committee. Today we are joined by Dr. Shaquan Gaither, second committee member. This committee also features Dr. Tim Bagwell, who is the URR. And today's doctoral study final oral defense is for the final dissertation defense for Ki-Young Kim, titled Best Practices for Constitutional Government Under the South Korean Framework of Democratic Experimentalism. So, without further ado, Ki-Young, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you for joining my oral defense. I'm so moved to reach this milestone and pleased to present my final study. My present honor is deeply owed to your generous mentorship, professors. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to you. I've long elaborated on the topic I'm now presenting, say constitutionalism and democracy, which of course has been held to focus on the Korean government and practice. Doctoral, formed and style editor, suggests to change my title, which is sought to nuance or morph it, which I try to diverge and explain. So the title of this edition will slightly change it, as you note in the final submission a week ago. The assistance was immeasurable to reform my draft dissertation to fit within Walden dissertation requirements and according to the dissertation depository process. Since errors in the publication process generally is intolerable, my effort to comply with the suggestions and advice has been made vigilantly through the final submission. The final copy is face of author directory and may be related with the reputation of mentor professors. That is my course to spend 10 days, time and again, for error-free final version. I expect no or at least marginal error, if any, so that the piece is regarded as perfect, at least in terms of form and style aspect. Let me advance to present orally the major points of final study. As you see in the PowerPoint slides sent before this presentation, I organized my work into 4 sections in this oral discussion. The first section is a preparatory work to explore the background of study, problems in the topic, my purpose for research, and research questions which I like to know through this study, and literature to be reviewed as pertains to my research study. This area of presentation generally overlaps my previous defense, February this year. The second section also is a preparatory work, which, however, deals with the method and research design. The pages of slide, as you confirm, got through my details of research operation, covering participants and sample, data source and data collection, as well as data analysis. You can see my previous oral presentation for proposal at page 11, titled Final Study Defense. This slide mainly bears the titles and subtitles through which I had explained in proposal oral defense and for 3 chapters in dissertation. Of course, adaptation was made to finalize this dissertation. In section 3, I introduced the overview of research findings and my order of discussion on each theme and research question. So I've reiterated one central question as well as 3 secondary questions pertaining to each section. I also grounded the field data and analyzed results within 9 major themes considered essential to bring the best practice of Korean constitutional government, say most faithful to constitutional tradition and participatory democracy for best effective or productive government in Korea. You are known to my order findings, the first 2 themes as related with the CRQ. CRQ means central research question, and research question 1 would be secondary. 4 themes following for central research question and research question 2. Last 3 themes for a central research question and research question 3. All these were summarized in one heading, as you see around the end of this dissertation, and I presented a summary for the result of my investigation. And I gave him a nickname. I gave it a nickname titled K9CD. CD means constitutional democracy, which I suppose would be a factor facilitating wider understanding about my case. The 4 themes were given a heading, Conditions to Reform and Consolidate the Civil Society. I may have chance to brief about each section if time permits. As you read through the area of these sections, you'll know the tables were entailed at the end of each heading, which provides the relevant research questions, points of discussion, and possible answers to research questions. That will hopefully help to illuminate a readership within a myriad of detailed information and difficult argument to follow. The second 4 themes relate with the theory of government system and human resources or public officers, which I have explained under the 4 headings titled Public Officers as Change Agents, Parliamentary System as a Unitary Forum for Productive Government, Decentralization and Competitiveness and Independent Agency. The third 3 themes deal with the soft character of vested rights, the kind of prophylactic rule as practiced within the jurisprudence of the United States. In this paradigm of understanding, a new perspective to the vested rights can be practiced in terms of democratic experimentation. Most sensitive would be concern of national paradigm of market economy and economic justice. An increasing foreign immigration and workforce are also one of social issues for congruent constitutionalism and participatory democracy. Multiculturalism was heavily voiced by research participants for best practice of constitutional government in South Korea. Between the developmentalist and environmentalist disagreement, constitutional minds commonly agree on new deals with rising international movement, what is called Greenpeace. Certain limitation in research study is inherent, according to Creswell, which should be avoided at feasible extent. That will improve the result of research study as not as speculative. You can note a limitation in this research study on page 18. Or also mention this area of concern. For instance, the case of South Korea may be distant in view of legal system and constitutional tradition, which may render the result overgeneralized. This is the point of care through research operation. And unique history of Koreans for economic development, restoration of democracy, and so also factor to its bias of participants' point of view. It needs to be careful that it should not skew their perceptions and appreciation involved in the phenomenon of good constitutionalism. Selection of interview participants may prejudice the findings because they are highly socialized in viewpoint, but actually more private in nature. So candid opinion would be hard to achieve in some aspect. So that's the point I need to take care for objective result. Propensity of public officers to deny or restrict access to the documentation and records, as well as small sample size could be kind of limitations in the study. So there will be a factor that the readership or audience will need to have some point of understanding about reading through this research. And I also address later implications and recommendations. And let me turn to see the background of this research and data, method and design and problem statement, which should be brief since it was already presented in the last oral defense of proposal. For example, the background arises from the kind of extensive debate about the constitutional controversy in South Korea. As you see, two former presidents are now in prison, South Korea, because of corruption. The government is very bad reputation, has very bad reputation from the statistics of international institutions or indexes. For example, Swiss IMD and Samsung. Samsung is a hometown enterprise, but they would not be generous about the corruption index of South Korea. And also many criticism about potential imperialism or powerful presidency that could undermine the democratic process. So the public forum is fairly strong over that, and many alternatives will suggest to improve the practice of Korean government on constitutionalism. That would be the background of this study. So, for example, we need to be aware about the benefit of parliamentary system. What advantage of parliamentary system would be the interdependence of two branches for efficient government organization and action, parliamentary sovereignty to legitimate the rule of law, and history proven democratic election, the kind of advantage, and also disadvantage, the kind of discomforting evidence to deny a fit of a parliamentary system in this land. That system would fuel the rate of corruption in South Korea. There would be very strong criticism about this system, but the presidentialism is fairly biased in South Korea, and new concept of presidency would spoil our democracy. So more strong evidence denies the presidential system. And also many scholarly pieces would deal with this kind of a constitutional dilemma and national questions around global jurisdictions. The work from Linz, Valenzuela, and Fleischman, and Giovanni, and also Ho would be a notable Korean constitutional scholar. So that would form my background of study. the problem in this present status of this area study would be briefed in my problem statement. A preliminary review of the literature on South Korean politics and constitutionalism from a South Korean context suggests a lack of study in transparency and accountability in general, but particularly with respect to democratic experimentalism, a key element to suppose constitutional government. Though, for example, would be most profound scholar to impact this research study, and their paradigm is sought to improve our practice, although assumptions and limitations would work in implanting in this land. Prevalent literature seems to be limited to textual analysis or comparative discourse of global government and generalized statements and conclusions based on ad hoc policy surveys to address temporal requirements of government in Korean history. So I think that this constitutional crisis is generally prevailing and also not temporal, kind of a continued on continuum through many governments. So the kind of a foundational theory on values and effectiveness of government needs to be produced. So that is one motive as I yield K9 constitutional K9 elements for best practices of a South Korean government. The present literature appears to be a lack of research on democratic experimentalism as a key factor to suppose successful government, or which can serve as a mechanism to improve the constitutional system and practice in Korea. This is the gap in the literature I sought to fulfill. So, the purpose of this study was to better understand the constitutional government through democratic experimentalism in South Korea and explore the kind of alternatives for best practices of South Korean government. So, as scholars have noted, democratic experimentalism is necessary to support constitutional process and democracy building. By using the often several theory of constitutional democratic experimentalism for my theoretical framework, I sought to provide a common conceptual framework that might serve to improve the constitutional practice of constitutional government. And I also sought to raise awareness and bring attention to a growing global problem of questionable constitutional policy and diminishing government success. By including key informants from academia and professional groups within the scope of investigation, the study can also provide a broader perspective on the constitutional discourse through an evaluation of democratic experimentalism and learning by monitoring. My research questions have one central one and three secondary questions. Let me reiterate. How central question would be how does democratic experimentalism support constitutional government in South Korea? Research question one is what are key differences between the centralized government organizational form and decentralized organizational form in the capacity to support constitutional government in South Korea? Research question two likes to address the question, how does a national framework support the constitutional government in South Korea? Research question three is, what is the role of individualized in supporting constitutional government in South Korea? So the three key elements were elaborated by Dov what actually thrust into my research question. and also that would be continued on theoretical framework. And the nature of this study is about math and research design. This study offers an opportunity to advance our understanding of constitutional policy and practice in the implementation of democracy, with hope for improving the success of government and maximizing the happiness of the people in South Korea. This study is qualitative research. Qualitative research is appropriate to obtain a complex, detailed understanding of how the constitutional government system may be improved to maintain and enhance the protection of rights and democratic process, encouraging an effective and stable government, leading to its success and increasing the happiness of the people. By conducting the case study of Korean government and democratic experimentalism, as well as interviewing people on the issue of learning by monitoring, the research can coherently explain the perceptions and attitudes to formulate a better view of constitutional interpretation and deliberative of democratic process that fits well within the traditionally rigid constitutional system in Korea. The study should provide insight into points of constitutional and political importance, often an enhanced understanding of successful constitutional government, and help address the current challenges and revision movement. Scope of delimitations or presented in the first part of this dissertation. The general study guidelines were kept at my best ability. Sample size of 16 interviews as being appropriate from this Korean case study. This study employs a purposive sampling reflecting that the interviews are most knowledgeable to provide in-depth information to understand the Constitution and democratic government. So many experts about the issue of Constitution in South Korea, for example, professors in law discipline and social scientists, journalists, lawyers were in contact to yield valuable information, and the texts, treatises, and Korean articles, along with pieces of original states, United States, and other pieces imprinted in European context, would inform to produce this dissertation. This research study is so significant. From a scholar perspective, this research is significant in that it will help fill an existing gap in the literature that examines constitutional issues in South Korea, providing a connective and relational explanation of how constitutional government functions in South Korea, and explaining the dichotomy that exists between the constitutional tradition and democratic experimentalism. This study is also significant in exposing key factors and elements of Korean constitutionalism, which support government transparency and accountability, and consequently improve the public's perception of government in South Korea. The findings from this research might help future scholars better interpret the South Korean constitutional system and its democratic and deliberative process. From a practitioner's perspective, this study is significant given the seemingly general lack of understanding of democratic experimentalism as a key driver of constitutional government. The results from this study can serve decision makers and public servants in general to make better informed decisions and support a more democratic and transparent government. In terms of social change, this study presents an opportunity to shed light on what appears to be an understudied area of inquiry. The hope of this researcher is that this exploration will spawn new related studies and generate additional material research. Likewise, bringing attention to this important issue has the potential to increase civic engagement and greater collaboration between the public and government officials. So this part will be made more detailed in later of this dissertation, social implications. So you will see table keys about elements about social impact. So let me have a chance to browse through the 9 themes. The first 2 themes are conditions to reform. On my investigation, the most critical condition for success of constitutional reform and productive government is common awareness about the need for and basic direction of reform that is shared and compassion by the political parties and citizens alike. Interviews were commonly concerned with conditions, which are sought to underlie the reform movement in order to determine the success of reform and government system. You may refer to table 9 about the research questions and points to discussion about this theme and the list of answers to the research questions. The consolidated civil society is the second theme in my result. A consolidated democracy has been an ideal that the interviews identified for constitutional reform to result in the success of government. It requires an embedded people-oriented value system in which the sustained cultural practice is to deal with political issues and agendas in an invariable and routinely demonstrable manner that is consistent with the proven democratic requirements and procedures. So the civil society is soil to breed a democracy and the Republican ideas about constitutional tradition. So that is very basic to obtain the first 2 secondary research questions. You refer to table 10 about participant response for central research question and research question. Public officers as change agent is my third theme, and would give some possible answers to my research question. Public officers are an important element for the success of democratic experimentalism. They are required to execute their constitutional duty within the new framework, learning by monitoring, experimentation, and coordination, making decisions for recycling the process. They need to be loyal to the value of democracy, cherish education or experimentation, and appreciate communicative justice to reach an ultimate decision. So public education as originated from the idea of a John Dewey, a kind of element to base modern democracy as public education and public communication for equal justice. And the kind of idea would be received by Dove and Saville. And also it would be an element to enrich our experience about a constitutionalism in South Korea. And it could be continued through the subsequent generations of government, I suppose. I believe so. Dove Saville also proposed priorities and requirements for congressmen, public agency, and court judges. My fourth theme would be titled Unitary Reform. So I cordially suggest some of a priority about parliamentary system more than a presidential government. That would provide relatively more fit to address current challenges in South Korea. According to Dolph and Sabo, the democratic experimentation does not alter the constitutional tradition. However, centralized and decentralized form of organization, direct deliberation, plurality, learning by monitoring, coordination should occur to an effective paradigm of participatory constitutionalism. Both types of values would contingent, as Europeans argue, but necessary and history proven to be inseparable to Republican democracy. That does not mean the current presidential system should be either tarnished or reformed, where the transformation of the governmental system to a parliamentary one is the major desire of the people as interviews corroborated. That would be impractical and less possible in the United States, since it is a big country of great demography and manages a federal system of dual sovereignty. So presidential, of course, you know, the United States is the original state of presidential system of government and parliament system for European states. So they will not fit within the United States. But Korea is nanny state, as you see. Again, some discomforting evidence about the more corruptive activities in parliamentary system. I would like to suggest the major desire of parliamentary system as an alternative of constitutional reform. In case of South Korea, a number of interviews pointed out the importance of parliamentary system and public education in order to faithfully implement democratic experimentalism. Of course, skepticism also was expressed, as I noted earlier. And independent administrative agency, it's a kind of United States system in public administration, is a strong alternative to improve the practice of constitutional government in South Korea. So I titled it Small, Independent, and Strong. It's kind of a special agency on expertise in specific fields that could advance the kind of codes proposed by Dolph and Sabo. So what experts about flexible understanding of rights and learning by monitoring by empowered empowered independent administrative agency. The kind of a special agency would help to implement the idea of a Dolph and Sabo. So I discussed that point and articulated some possible answers in the table. We have seen that the public agencies act under the hierarchy and line of command, in which they constantly inquire the best alternative to guide their actions and decision making. The interviewees often mention the independence and expertise of public administrators, which they consider as sustaining performative and normative ideas. So my dissertation has two domains about successful government. Performative, the word performative normally pertains to effectiveness of government and public administration, and the kind of a democratic experimentation through avenues of a public policy or administration. Normative covers the constitutional tradition, and that will be a combination for successful government. So because we are under the rule of law, without the constitution, the effectiveness of government would normally mean the government of communism or kind of a tyranny for best efficiency. So that should be combined to yield an ideal paradigm of government. As previously mentioned, the old and new public administration comprise two vehicles of life inherent in the discipline, thus directly translated into the success of governmental system. They instead offer the ontological and normative knowledge are indispensable and essential ingredients to formulate or implement agency and public policy. And decentralization and competitiveness comes as my theme. As I noted earlier, two international indexes plainly show our reality with respect to matters of great concern to public administration, namely what is the competitiveness of nations concerning social conflict. The observation of two statistics generally supports a hypothesis: the smaller governmental units are more likely prone to be competitive or socially compatible in terms of public administration. That idea, status of South Korean politics will be very akin to the assumptions made by Dobson and Savelle. In our experience, conservative priorities focused on decentralization, pluralistic autonomy, and competitiveness have resonated with this hypothesis. Since the interviews characterized the success of government within a framework of competitiveness and social satisfaction, a centralized form of government or with the plenary power of oversight through a singular form of government is fairly problematic. The paradigm of a central functioning through geographically dispersed system needs to be resolved. The opposite, a decentralized and small autonomous system of associate units seems highly preferable. And also, I have briefed on economic justice and Korean constitutionalism as my theme in K9. Constitutional reform and successive government in Korea necessarily requires a discussion concerning the necessary relationship between constitutional policy and economic justice. Such constitutional policy may be similar to the concept of social investing and principle of trust delineated by Langbein and Foster in private law. In other words, the declaration of Constitution brings the role of government nearer to trustship to help the national economy prosper and survive. It also requires that the government be responsible to create and administer structure for social investing and planning for the public welfare. So the kind of idea to adapt the private context of dimension to the public context of dimension will be realized at extent in terms of this economic justice terminology. The suggestion is to maintain the fundamentals of constitutional mandate and proceed conservatively through the communicative or participatory concept of democracy. Hence, the key thoughts drawn from the empirical findings of this research study can be compatible with that of the author Savelle, that the contingencies between the hard legal tradition and national economy or market on the other hand, and civil society on democratic experimentalism on the other, are indurable. But that should be incremental with mutual learning. So incrementalism is kind of idea that embedded in Gulf and South Savelle framework, and social congruence and multiculturalism was presented as my theme. The success of government in this global age is not only a political or economic, but also relies on the growth of social cultural satisfaction within the community. The social change requires a policy focus to respond with the growing multiculturalism and possible discrimination against the influx of peoples of different color, race, or ethnicity. Since Korea has a long history of common ethnic origin and the impact of foreign immigration has actually been tenuously minimal, and democracy and political culture have in fact been blind to the potential conflict and challenge arising from a growing heterogeneity of community. The conservative element in this regard militates against the speedy adaptation of Western democracy and liberalism and dissuade the people from communication and participation. Provided that the democratic experimentation holds a critical assessment for the two paradigms against constitutional tradition and is grounded on various Western philosophies, constitutional government on democratic experimentalism theory has a background with the U.S. historiography profile of democracy and communitarian jurisprudence on race, sex, and or ethnicity, and so on. So that paradigm developed in the United States would also be imported for successful government in South Korea. Now the immigration statistics or foreign workers are increasing. So that idea would be critically developed to adapt to the Korean context of constitutionalism. So the development of increasing multiculturalism in the mainstream of South Korea implies changing Korean foundation, for which the terms and requirements offered by doctrines can simply operate as a model to follow, yet only thoughtfully with critical eye. And the other topic is Korean constitutionalism and Greenpeace. Throughout the investigation, the core of the reformers voiced low carbon economy and Greenpeace message as one that is indispensable to safeguard constitutionalism. This phenomenon reflects global political discourse between the developmentalists and environmentalists, systemized through foundationally agenda, disagreements, and consensus formulated through diplomacy and multilateral treaty agreements. There would be other area left for presentation, but as time is very near, so I like to advise to refer to my dissertation finally, and also the recommendation and implications for visible in your slides. So the social implications table provided by Walden University are very wise to grasp my possible hope through many societies in South Korea as a community. For example, KDP, Korean Judicial Policy Institute, has been newly instituted about years ago, and now very active to hold conference and symposiums about judicial policy and how we address the challenges of Korean constitutionalism, and many organizations on democratic cause in South Korea, for example, civil association about monitoring and reacting against government practice, and also the global professors vigilant to monitor the government, and activists and journalists, the kind of a group who read my, I hopefully encounter my peers and develop the course of action and so recommendations. Public policymakers would be recommended to ponder on the kind of ideas and suggestions and criticism worked out in my research study. And also scholars would be allowed to deal with new challenges in, across various topics related with my theme, and so the three avenues to develop my research study by scholars. For example, future studies may need to be on the principle of philosophy, kind of works would be found in Foucault, Habermas, and series on deliberative democracy. And future studies on the cases, for example, in the European context, we may illustrate the book as one of influential scholarship. And future studies on diverse structural or experimental design, Dolphin and Sabot, and as well as Wilkins, would proceed, would advance through this kind of avenue. And jurists, congressmen, public officers, and Lawyers Association on Democracy and Good Government, the Association for Civil Participation, would be notable groups to sustain Korean democracy. So there would be one collaborator to develop my cause. Judicial Policy Research Institute and conference and symposium has been mentioned. So there will be all. I hope you understand my dissertation.
Okay. Hello.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ki-young. That was it was very difficult. It's a very difficult dissertation because it has so many parts, and the findings are dense. It's I commend you for having done this and challenged yourself to do this, because it is not an easy subject matter, and it's sometimes you can get lost very quickly. On that note, Dr. Gaither, if you don't mind, if I will jump in first, because I have a question that is very simple for Ki-young, and perhaps that question might serve you well as far as your questions. And I'm going to, So Ki-young, you're going to be a scholar. You are a scholar. You're going to be part of an academy, and a part of being an academic and a scholar is being able to present research findings in a manner that is simple, and it's kind of like you could explain to a 4-year-old in the words of Denzel Washington in the movie Philadelphia a few years ago. Can you present it to a 4-year-old in a way that the 4-year-old will understand what you mean? And because these subject matter are so dense and complicated, and the wording and is so complex that it's hard to comprehend sometimes really what the question asked and what the answer is. And so I'd like you to refer back to your slide number 14, please. And I think in this slide, as I heard your presentation, I was also looking for. You say you have in your slides, you have the final study defense in slide 13, and then you have interpretation of findings, slide 14, and then you continue on with the interpretation of findings in slide 15. But what I didn't find, and this is my question, is the findings themselves, meaning it's one thing is the interpretation of the findings, but before we can interpret them, we need to know what they are. We need to know, for example, how does democratic experimentalism support constitutional government in South Korea? And of course, you have these supporting questions, but I want to hear a simple answer as to how democratic experimentalism supports constitutional government, as if you were explaining to a colleague or somebody who is not well versed in your dissertation. So and what I meant about not seeing the findings is I would have liked to have seen a slide that says democratic experimentalism supports constitutional government by A, B, and C, which you have done a great job in providing all of these findings in your study, and they are there, so we're not concerned about that. But it's important that they are clearly visual, that we can see them and find a simple way to answer the question. So my question for you is to simply think of yourself as presenting this study at a conference, and you have to explain to somebody who hasn't read your dissertation, how does democratic experimentalism support constitutional government in South Korea? And so the 2-minute answer is what I'm looking for. Does that make sense?
For example, Dr. Sabo's idea about public education should be more reinforced in South Korea. There would be the kind of element for good constitutionalism in this way. And also about the public offices. So the framework proposed by Dr. Sabo, for example, new paradigm with what is kind of a new understanding about paradigmatic congressmen or jurists. They should act to learn and monitor for final decision making. The kind of idea would be very helpful to support the Korean constitutionalism. Public officers become a change agent and new role to faithfully execute the result of democratic experimentation. And the kind of discussion was presented in my dissertation, and also found you might be confused about my final study defense slides. The area would be pertinent in the final study order defense from page 12. Page 1 through 11 would be the kind of our concern about the proposal stage, and I briefed before I begin with section 3. So please don't be confused. Is it kind of answer, Professor?
Okay. All right. I still have some questions. Dr. Gaither, would you like to continue with some questions on your own, please?
Yes. I put the phone on mute. I apologize. As I listened, Ki-young, I'm sorry, I know that this has been a long process, and there is a lot of information that you shared and present in your dissertation, as well as what you presented this evening with your oral defense. And as you shared information, I did think about just from the findings that you have. You mentioned in your background the reason why you did the study, or the reason, some of the reasons, for the issue surrounding democracy in South Korea. And I was wondering if your findings support that, let me get the wording correctly, that the democratic experimentalism will help bring about the change with the South Korean government's reputation and corruption that was an issue. And I guess that kind of maybe goes to the research, to the central research question.
Yes, you correctly point to the motivation of this research and the kind of impact I would like to exert over various interest groups. So the kind of ineffective performance of government would lie in transparency. The kind of evil can be remedied by participatory democracy. So one goes to improve constitutional practice in South Korea, and also competitiveness will also be practiced if the government is not transparent. So kind of elements have been discussed through the chapters as happened in chapter 4.
Okay, and
kind of go ahead, please.
I'm sorry. Were you finished?
Yes, I'm finished.
Oh, okay. I was just wondering, in your interviews, was that something that came out in the as one of the themes about transparency in the government?
Yes, so frequent to encounter that kind of mentions, especially in the journalists who will be serious about corruption of public officers.
Okay. I'm sorry, give me one moment.
Sure.
And with the, you mentioned the public officers being the change agents that will help to transform or change democracy in South Korea. And based on your findings and your interpretation of the findings, is that something that is likely to be achieved? And I know you mentioned incrementalism and incremental change being part of it and awareness being part of it, but will there be support from the public officers to actually implement this change?
Yes, the citizen in South Korea has kind of different culture in some aspects from other Western states. They would prefer one for solution. For example, you may be exposed to 촛불 시위 in South Korea last year, very widely known about international journalism, newspaper, perhaps featured in your hometown newspaper. That would be the kind of distinct culture against the rational and incremental public office as change agent. So I have some contrast about that point in my dissertation. 촛불시 actually was successful to impeach two former presidents. One lady president was impeached, and other MB administration also put to jail, now waiting for sentence, perhaps for 10 years in prison term. Very worse in the constitutional reality in South Korea, and still government is discussing a paradigm of constitutional reform, and kind of a complicated development now was carried in scene. So this station is hopefully one kind of solution to be considered together the Korean Constitution.
Okay. Okay. I think those are all my questions at the moment.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Gaither. Okay, Keong, I have a couple more questions for you, and the first one is in regards to a theme that I recall when I read your final study, and that's this Korean trauma. You mentioned Korean trauma, and you mention it several times, and it's part of your study, and it grows out of the Korean experience and historical culture, etc. So, can you just explain to us what is this Korean trauma, and because it was identified in the findings, and so if you could please just tell us a little bit about what you mean by this Korean trauma as it came out in the findings.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Korean trauma is obviously the kind of tyranny over a decade of militaristic reign in Korean democracy. So, 20 years by General Park to suppress civil society and derogate the human rights, and the subsequent militaristic government by Chun Doo-han also been problematic, but a little improved. And finally, 1987 Constitution is a very significant, now standing, and also considered to reform that would restore the Korean democracy in very important aspects. Now, Korea is directly elected by Korean people. The kind of a gymnasium election delegated by people and absolutely influenced by a president, held the perfect election to reinstate the status of military general. So there would be a great dissatisfaction and a trauma of South Korea. And 1987 Constitution is far better and import many of elements of developed constitutionalism, but also exhibit the kind of challenges and grievances because of imperialistic practice of presidency that would address the current status of Korean constitutional challenge and dilemma. So my expression is a little bit related to provoke the leadership trauma. Sorry.
Okay. Okay, very good, very good. Thank you for that response. I have one last question, and I'm here. I jotted down here. Give me 1 second as I find it in my notes here, please. And so let me see. I can't. Give me 1 second, please. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah, I think finding it here. Just a second. Okay, here we go. You mentioned that in your findings, so you identified these 9 themes, and conditions to reform, consolidated civil society, etc. So you identify these 9 themes, and then in Table 8, and I'm looking at your study, Table 8, you have characteristics, transformation, and reform by interviewees. And in this table, you identify aspects to affect the constitutionalism and government success. And as I'm looking at this, from the number of times mentioned, the one that seems to come out the most here is an educational or cultural process for habitus on the democracy theme 3, 4, and 6. And so, from just by looking at that, this educational or cultural process, are you suggesting then that for this to work, and perhaps one of the necessary conditions for democracy, for the new democracy or democratic experimentalism in South Korea, would require, one of those necessary conditions is require education, to educate the populace and the people about what democracy is, what it implies, what does it mean in terms of rights, in terms of the separation of powers, and in terms of the relationship between the state and the citizen. Is that how I should interpret that? And that's my question for you.
Yes. As I said, the communicative or participative democracy has long been elaborated by many social scientists, as originated from John Dewey and other schools for public education and enhancement of civil democracy. That idea was implanted deeply in Korean professionals. So through the interview process, I found many mentions and emphasized heavily is necessary to improve a practice of South Korean government. So as I said, the atmosphere is fairly favorable about public education. The constitutional discourse, principally led by Constitutional Court of South Korea and many scholars involved in constitutional codes are very active to disseminate the concept of justice and elements of democracy through the public. So the condition is very immature, and I also see new development about the government policy focus. So establishment of Korean Judicial Policy Institute is notable to collect the ideas about good practice of government on constitutionalism. And the conference and symposium would be the kind of avenue that many scholars would avail of about the findings, and I may be one of them in the short future.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Okay. Thank you very much, Ki-young, for answering my questions. Dr. Gaither, do you have any questions, any more questions for Ki-young?
I was just curious, where do you see, I know that you listed some recommendations as far as doing more study, additional or further studies on topics related to democracy on different cases. You mentioned on slide, I'm looking at slide 20.
Yeah.
Is that
I mean, on the page? Okay.
on slide 20, your recommendations, is it that more study needs to happen before change can come, or that needs to happen in addition to what you have found in your research?
The research also one of responsibility, as I illustrate in Association for Civil Participation in South Korea. So in combination, you may understand my recommendations. So in global academia, I like to illuminate kind of avenues that we further develop. And also in South Korean context, local researchers who have exert more focus on details about my 9 things. So that is my recommendation.
Okay. And I guess one last question. Did the findings, based on the research questions that you asked, were the findings what you thought or expected them to be, or did they surprise you in any kind of way?
Yes, I think so. They would deal with the kind of question generally, but what a comprehensive and more focus on democratic expectation led as I began with this presentation. And I would interact with kind of a scholar groups in South Korea for refinement of my answers, which is how they resolve because it is social science. Should be incremental, as Dope and Sub also suggest.
Okay. Those are all the questions that I have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gaither. Okay, thank you very much, Ki-young. So at this time, Ki-young, if you would please allow us, Dr. Gaither and I, 3 minutes. If you could please put down your phone or mute the phone or what have you to put it down so that we can talk, digress about it, and determine if what's next. Okay, so if you could please do that, and then come back. When you come back, just come back and say I'm back. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So what do you think, Shaquan?
I'm sorry. Okay. I think that in the dissertation that there are clear findings and connections with themes. I think you made a good point that I think there's just a lot. There are a lot of themes. There's a lot of information to connect back to those three questions, kind of sub questions in the overarching question. And on some points I think there's clear, like I can see clearly the answer and how it connects, and on other points I'm not quite clear, and I'm still trying to figure out if that's just potentially a language barrier or in presenting the information. Like if I'm looking for something specifically and it's there, it's just not presented in the way that I'm expecting it because of language. So
I think you and I are on the same page as far as that, because I being an international and a student and having English not be my first language, I do know that sometimes you think other languages, and when you speak another language first, you do think and express yourself differently, and just I think the Korean language and the way that Asian
cultures, the way that they express themselves is different than we do in the U.S. And so I think I'm sure and I'm confident that he has answered the questions on the dissertation. They're there. What I would have liked to have seen is a clear articulation or clear presentation, as you said, of how this does that, and so the relationships, right? RQ or RQ1, RQ2, and RQ3. But I guess so. So I'm okay. Keon?
Yeah, I'm okay.
I'm sorry. Give us a couple more minutes, please. I'm sorry. Just give us 2 more minutes.
Okay.
So here's what I recommend, if it's okay with you. What I recommend is I think he's okay to go. I think he's okay to but I would like to see. At
the end of the day,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. No, you go ahead. I'm sorry.
I would like to see perhaps just a slide or in the dissertation, if he could just in his findings to have one a chart where he provides the key, the key differences, because he found many differences, but the key differences are 2 or 3, and so and how does the democratic experimentalism supports constitutional government in South Korea through a number of ways. Based on the findings, the most prevalent ones in the findings were A, B, and C. That's really all I wanted to see. So something like that.
Right.
Okay. But,
I think that would be more succinct.
You said at the end of the day.
Right. I was saying at the end of the day, as I was thinking about it, I feel like the dissertation provides more than enough information to answer. Maybe more. I mean, it provides more information, but I think, like you were saying, if there was like one succinct table or maybe an illustration would be better than just the written. Than a paragraph or a section, another section of the dissertation, just to show a clear connection. Like, here's the clear, simple version of how the findings in the questions, how the findings answer the questions or didn't answer the questions. And they did answer the questions. It's just a lot of themes that answered the questions. Maybe what are the top 3 that answer those questions, like you said? Okay. And so what I was saying at the end of the day, I think the paper is fine, and the oral defense may not have been able to highlight or simplify all that was included in the dissertation. I agree. In a simplified way. Yeah.
But are we in agreement that he does pass?
Yes, that's what I do agree. I agree that his paper supports him in passing.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is then when he comes back, Keon, are you there? Okay, so when he comes back, I'm just going to let him know and congratulate him.
Okay.
and then
a long journey.
Yeah, it has been, and he started a while ago. I thank you for your support and your guidance as well. And but what I guess what I'll ask him to do is just to provide to us, or just incorporate that into his paper as a final condition. But assuming that he does that. It should be good. Mainly, it's for his benefit, so that then because he's going to publish, and when he begins to present this, other people that come to read his stuff are going to be able to cite him and use that evidence, and it just makes it a lot easier.
Right.
To find the findings, really. I mean, after all, you're answering a question, right? So you should be able to answer that question to somebody in 2 minutes, right?
Right. Yeah.
It supports it because of this, because of that, and because of that. And sure, there's 20 other reasons why it supports it, but there's always one or two that seem to come out in the themes all over.
True. Right.
Okay.
I agree.
Keong, I think you're there.
Uh-oh.
B.
Okay.
And I think it's also, it has, I think, something to do with the language, which is also why I'm not overly concerned, because I'm sure that if he was explaining to somebody, if he was explaining this in Korean, it would flow so just naturally.
Simply, like to a 4-year-old. Yeah.
So.
Hello. Okay. Uh-oh. I wasn't sure if he came back. Maybe not.
May I join?
Okay.
Are you there?
May I join?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. All right. So, Keong, I know it's been a long journey, and I have the pleasure and the honor of joining your committee, Dr. Shaquan Gaither, in welcoming you to the Academy, Dr. Keong Kim. So congratulations.
Yes, congratulations.
Thank you for
I think you should pat yourself on the back. I think you did a wonderful job. It's like we said, it's been a long journey, a difficult one, and it's had its obstacles, and you persevered, and I think you should be proud of the work that you've done and and the contribution that you've made to the Academy. I think both in Korea and as well as to scholarship in the U.S. And so, good job with that. I will send you one concern that Dr. Gaither and I had was with the actual presentation of the findings, which for your own benefit, it might be wise to include in your final draft a chart that provides a very quick reference as to how the findings, meaning that the findings are there, you have them in your study. But a chart that says, for example, how does democratic experimentalism support constitutional government in Korea? And then have a chart of the key ways it does, like the ones that you found most in the findings, A, B, and C, for example. And then the secondary questions, what are the key differences between a centralized organizational form, so on and so forth. So the key differences, right? I know there's many differences, but the key differences might be one or two. So which ones are those? And then how does a national framework support the constitutional government? So in a chart, so that when somebody comes to look at your dissertation, they can go into those charts and get quick access. And then, of course, they can cite you and they can further the research, because that's also part of this, right? You want others to come in and pick up where you left off, okay? So I'll provide you with an email with those instructions. But again, congratulations, well done, and I will be letting you know what the next steps are, okay? So, Dr. Keong Kim, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes, congratulations.
Very well. So I'm going to I'm going to stop the recording at this moment.
Have a good day.
Okay.
Okay.